All right, we'll get started as it's 3 minutes after, and we can use to get started because we have a lot to cover. So I'm Caroline Eister. I'm the Director of Fair Housing and Commercial Property here at the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. I would also at this time like to introduce OC Mellinger, Brittany Mellinger, my colleague, who is off camera right now, assisting with tech support and letting everyone in. And many of you who attend our Empower Hours every month are familiar with Brittany. Also, I'd like to thank and welcome Max, our captioner, as well as Deb, our ASL interpreter, and I believe she's been joined by Hetty as well for ASL interpretation. So welcome everyone behind the scenes and everyone who's joined us today to speak about rural communities. That is our topic for today. So the title of the presentation is Overcoming Barriers to Fair Housing in Rural Communities, but we hope to have an open and lively discussion on the challenges and also the opportunities available in these areas. Will you, Brittany, will you advance my slides, if you don't mind? Maybe Okay, so we'll begin with fair housing. And what we need to know about fair housing in Pennsylvania is that it's your right. It's not just laws to designate to protect just one group of people. It protects everyone throughout the Commonwealth and through every phase of life. So our training goals today are to provide an overview of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, the PHRC, to identify relevant fair housing protections that you may or may not be aware of, to discuss fair housing barriers and opportunities in rural communities, as I mentioned previously, to provide an overview of the complaint process, and to answer your fair housing questions. Also, PHRC, through these trainings and through this training in particular, hope that this forum enhances our understanding of the challenges and the issues and goals of those living in rural communities, and to empower the Commission's outreach, education, and resource support, and to be tailored to the needs of those communities. So, who is the PHRC? The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission has a two-part mission. One is to enforce the Pennsylvania non-discrimination laws, specifically the PA Human Relations Act and the Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act. And we promote equal opportunity for all of Pennsylvania, is the second part of the mission. How do we promote that equal opportunity? We do that through key partnerships with Community Relations and Activity Task Force, with Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission advisory councils. That's groups of volunteers throughout the Commonwealth that keep an eye on emerging issues in their communities, and they call the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission attention to those issues. Through local human relations commissions. Many areas have their own local human relations commissions, and through affirmatively furthering fair housing task force. And we were one of the founding organizations there. We partner with public housing authorities, municipal officials, housing counseling agencies, and fair housing enforcement agencies. We discuss issues in fair housing that affect some groups more than others, and we collaborate on solutions. And also through housing advocacy groups. Oh, sorry, I'm behind on my slides a little bit, I apologize. Okay, so looking at the state, our map of the state, you can see that the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, we sit centrally in Harrisburg, but we have 3 regional offices. So in the bottom right-hand corner, you see our Philadelphia area. We have a Philadelphia regional office. Centrally, our Harrisburg regional office covers the area in the medium shade of blue, and then the dark blue is our Pittsburgh regional office. So as our complaints come in, they would be divided by geographical area. In most cases, that is how we cover the state in terms of how we receive complaints and potentially investigate them. So, I mentioned the non-discrimination laws in Pennsylvania, and here on this slide, we see what the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act covers, and you can see that's employment, housing is specific to today, what we're discussing, commercial property, public accommodations, primary and secondary education. The Pennsylvania Fair Educational Opportunities Act is the other non-discrimination law that covers post-secondary education. So we're going to talk next about the fair housing laws and what they cover. So fair housing laws cover the sale and rental of housing and housing related transactions. Can anyone offer in the chat what are some examples of housing related transactions? When we think of, oh, good. Thank you, Esther. Rentals would be something related to housing transactions, sales of homes. Excellent. So thinking, oh, perfect. Thank you, Peggy. Loans. Think of more transactions around the sale and rental of housing. So loans would definitely be that. Also with loans, hand in hand would go refinancing or getting an appraisal. Thank you, great examples. So what types of housing are covered? So types of housing would be apartments, single family homes, mobile home parks, condominiums, public housing, nursing homes, dormitories, and more. Example that could fall under commercial property and public accommodation depending would be something like an Airbnb. So the laws are created to be vast, and it may be some types of housing that we haven't thought about. So when we look at discrimination in these areas, under these laws, we look at hello? All right, are we still on? Hello? Can everyone hear me?
We can hear you, but your picture is frozen.
Oh, okay, yeah, something happened on this end. Let me see if I can fix that. But the presentation is still up, right? So let's see. Well, that's not happened. Okay, can you see my screen? Looks like the camera went blank too. Well,
we only see the interpreter and the chat.
Can you see me now?
We see you, but not your
slides. Can you minimize the team screen on your screen so we can get back to your presentation?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to do that now. Oh,
perfect. You're good now.
Okay,
Yes.
I'm having a hard time seeing everybody, but we can make it. So I would like to get back to, if you could just monitor the chat and I'll work on getting back to that. Okay, so I believe this is where we were. No, I got way ahead. Everybody just pretend like you didn't see the rest of the that part of the presentation. Wow, it's advancing the opposite way that I want it to. I don't have any control over that. All right, let's see how I can fix this. Perhaps this, how's that?
Would you like me to take over screen sharing?
That might be good. I don't know what happened to the power while it all went off like that, but okay.
All right,
If you
just a
wouldn't
moment.
mind. There you go, Brittany. Thank you. That's much better. All right. What's the view like now?
Okay, so right now we're on the slide with fair housing laws. Is that where you would like to be?
I believe that's where we left off. Maybe one ahead right here. Yeah, that's it. Okay. Thank you everyone for your patience and for bearing through our technical difficulties that all at once the whole monitor went black. So I didn't know if we had a power surge or what have you, what would make sense. But so we were talking about when we look at the fair housing laws, what do they cover? We talked about that. So when we think about discrimination, we are looking at both disparate treatment and disparate impact. Disparate treatment would be directly discriminating against a member of a protected class. Disparate impact is a policy that impacts members of a protected class that may be neutral on its face, but when it's put into practice can have a negative impact on people of a certain protected class. So let's see if I can advance. I think you have to advance. Yeah, we're going to go back one, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you. So a little bit more about disparate impact. It's a policy that has a discriminatory effect, even if it appears to be neutral. During a criminal background check, it may have been discovered perhaps that a survivor may have had an assault charge. However, in many cases, they were defending themselves or someone else. And also disparate impact would be blanket bans or denying everyone with a criminal background would have a disparate impact because of the way they limit housing opportunities for survivors of domestic violence. So before we go to the next slide, let's look at what are some examples of protected classes. I know we got a sneak peek due to my technical difficulties on this side, but as I advance through all the slides, but in the chat, which I can pull up now. So in the chat, could we maybe discuss what are some examples of protected classes covered by the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act? Awesome. Sex, race, age, color. I see race and sex. Disability, awesome. Yes, and disability is the #1 protected class we see reflected in complaints in housing and across the board here at Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Awesome. Okay. Can we move to the next slide? So here we see that we have protections under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act that expand past what is covered federally. So we have race, color, national origin, familial status, which someone did mention in at least once in the chat, religion, sex, and disability. Pennsylvania Human Relations Act is expanded past that. So we have age 40 plus, ancestry, and the use, handling, or training of support animals for disability. So don't forget also to be familiar with your local ordinances, as I may have failed to mention before, because many times there are additional protections provided. Next slide. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about familial status here and what is covered under that. So when a little more description on the protected class of familial status. So that pertains to families with children under the age of 18, living with parents or legal custodians, pregnant persons, or people securing custody of children under the age of 18, and that does include foster children. Next slide. Sex. So we have offered and developed protections to expand in the class of sex here at Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, we'd like to clarify that while LGBTQ plus is not considered to be a protected class under the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, the PHRC recently finalized regulations that establish the term sex. And sex may refer to pregnancy status, childbirth status, sex assigned at birth, gender identity or expression, affectional or sexual orientation, differences in sex development. These regulations are utilized by the Commission in accepting complaints, conducting investigations, and adjudicating cases. And you can learn more via the link, and we will provide these slides for everyone after the training. So you can learn more at the link, Policy and Law, Pennsylvania Human Relations Act at the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, PA.gov. So disability, as I mentioned earlier, disability is the number one complaint in the number of complaints that we receive here in housing and in other divisions at the PHRC. So disability refers to a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more of a person's major life activities. So some examples of that would be caring for oneself in the terms of walking, seeing, hearing, speaking, breathing, learning, and or working. Fair housing laws protect those who have a disability, who have a history of a disability, or are regarded as having a disability. Exemptions would be an individual who is currently using illegal drugs. They are exempted under disability-related protections. That does not, however, include those who are in recovery. They must be in recovery. Individuals who pose a direct threat to the health and safety of others, they are also exempt from disability-related protection. So next, some discriminatory actions is what we will talk about next. So what is a discriminatory action? Some examples right here would be discriminatory statements, discriminatory inquiries, steering. An example of steering would be something like, well, I know you like this unit. Say I would be a housing provider, potentially looking for a tenant. So I say to them, I know you like this unit, but wouldn't you be better off in another unit, you know, by the playground or closer to the church, or anything that would steer somebody away from where they want to live versus where a housing provider might see them living. Refusal to sell, lease, or finance housing, unfair appraisals, predatory lending, discrimination in housing terms and conditions, unequal provision of services and facilities, sexual harassment, and refusal to provide reasonable accommodations and modifications. Does anybody have any comments they'd like to make on these discriminatory actions or anything to add to them in the chat? For more clarification on reasonable accommodations and modifications, along with service animals, that's a lot of what we see in housing. If you need any clarification, please drop your questions in the chat and we will get to them, if not before, definitely at the Q&A at the end of the session. So you can think about what you might want to ask on this or any part of the training. Okay. So, fair housing and rural communities. So this is exciting to talk about rural communities because Pennsylvania is vastly made up of many rural communities. There are actually 19 urban communities and the 48 remaining are rural here in Pennsylvania. So it affects a great part of our population. So all communities do not have the same resources. We're looking at, when we're thinking about that, we're thinking of the diversity in the types of housing. Think about what are affordable housing options, what's accessible, what are some healthy housing options, transportation, educational opportunities, community services, employment opportunities, internet options, and housing information. So in the chat, I would like it if everyone could, using this kind of as a thinking pool, like this particular slide, what do you think some challenges would be in rural communities versus communities where services are more clustered around the cities? So what could pose some challenges for people in rural communities? We take a few minutes and drop some ideas into the chat. Ooh. The question was, I'm sorry, I see that someone wants the question repeated. Using the information on this slide, I've invited people into the chat to maybe identify some areas where they think rural communities, people in rural communities, what challenges might they be faced with off the top of our heads. So I see some really great answers. Definitely transportation. That's something that we can take for granted in a more urban setting. You know, buses and definitely things like trains and subways, they're just not an issue. They're just not a reality in rural populations. Limited resources and diversity types, that's true. Not having exposure to that diversity. And that leads also to what Lynn has offered here, language barriers. Affordable housing, something definitely shared with some urban areas. And when we're thinking in terms of thinking about the limited access to services, mental health issues with like social isolation, limited access to healthcare and facilities, and a variety of doctors and healthcare professionals, and limited access and options when it comes to things like education, the quality of that education. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in terms of the infrastructure and the other types of resources that people in those communities are limited to. I think I would really like to bring up something, because I don't want to forget to bring it up later, Jessica's offering here of food deserts. And if you realize that in rural communities, they could be several miles to quality vegetables and healthy foods, and they may rely on different sources in between. And when we think of rural communities, sometimes we think of the farms and things like that, where we think that that would be maybe a positive thing about living in a rural community, but rural communities look different all across the Commonwealth. So food deserts are pretty common in these areas and lead to a lot of the health issues that we'll be talking about moving forward through here. So the healthcare access and education concerns, social equity, and environmental issues are all really important things that we will be discussing a little bit more, and that I'd like for everyone to think about. Next slide. So on this slide, we're looking at some of these issues when it comes to systemic housing inequality, steering urban renewal, FHA loans, single family zoning, and definitely some of the municipalities and area lawmakers in the smaller communities zoning. These all present challenges in rural communities as well. GI Bill benefits, redlining, blockbusting, housing inequality, racial covenants, racial segregation, and public housing, all areas of concern when we're talking about systemic housing inequality. Show us the next slide, please. Some challenges that we talked about earlier and expanded on here: financial and structural impacts and deindustrialization. We see that very commonly. We see deindustrialization in urban areas, and in rural communities it's no different, where jobs have moved outside of the geographic area, and then it's even more impacted by the lack of transportation systems to get people to work. Blight. Pennsylvania has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. Blight is a problem in rural areas as well as in urban areas. We see evidence of this, and the challenges of putting funds or getting things rebuilt or making room for new construction. There are challenges due to blight all over the Commonwealth. Lack of investment in new housing. Often construction costs are more expensive. It's more expensive to build in rural areas. So there could be reluctance for investment. Another reason. Lack of government resources or lack of awareness about government resources. Limited public transportation. Limited housing assistance programs. Restrictive zoning. Resistance to development of affordable housing. Higher construction costs, as I mentioned, the aging housing stock. Competition for remote workers, because oftentimes, sometimes people that are may have a second home or something in the rural in the rural area. And so there's competition for people who live in that area for housing, and people with higher incomes in urban areas. Income levels tend to be lower in rural communities. Lack of rental housing codes and environmental hazards. Same that can be in urban areas when we're talking about the age of the stock and those environmental hazards when we think of the inside of a home and things that need to be renovated, but also the chemicals and things used in rural farming communities. There are those environmental hazards to consider as well. We could go to the next slide. So next, I'd like to talk about who's impacted by these challenges. Seasonal workers, people with disabilities who have all the same challenges they may have in urban areas, and now impacting things like transportation or internet and broadband capabilities in rural areas present challenges for everyone who lives in those areas. Senior citizens and the intersection thereof with people on limited incomes, fixed incomes, and oftentimes our senior citizens can have the intersectionality with disabilities as well. Pregnant women and their limited access to various and healthcare workers or specialists that they may need. Low-income individuals, individuals with mental health needs, again, lack of access to the services and the variety in the services, veterans, and minority groups, and diversity may not, these areas may not be as diverse for people. And another point I'd like to bring up here is homelessness. Homelessness, we see it in urban areas more manifest, but homeless people are less visible in rural communities. Okay. So how can we advance equity in rural communities? Can do this through community partnership, fair housing training and information, investments in housing affordability and community infrastructure, first-time home ownership programs, advocating for municipal support for housing, programs that preserve housing stock, employing inclusionary zoning practices, utilizing community land trusts to acquire developable land and vacant housing, providing access to homebuyer education classes, finance, and maintenance counseling, because it's, again, one thing to develop the affordable housing, but then we have to put into place plans to maintain that. Remember, too, the more awareness, there are some challenges in getting the word out about and raising awareness on fair housing and other trainings and information. So, having people actually go into these communities and use different, maybe a variety of methods to bring information to people. Using that, being as creative as possible in those areas. So, how do we file fair housing complaints? I do want to share some information for everyone on how to file complaints for housing and any type of discrimination. This is applicable to at Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. So, to file a complaint, and to be able to contact us. We, as I mentioned, have our 3 regional offices in Harrisburg, Philadelphia, and Pittsburgh, and that information is on the screen. Also, you can call the number on the screen and make us aware through that via telephone as well to access our fair housing hotline. You can use our websites, and for definitely follow us on our social platforms, X, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. All that information is on this slide. So what happens when we receive the complaint after it comes in via one of those methods that we described on the previous slide? It goes through intake process. So if a person believes they have experienced housing discrimination, their first step is to connect with our intake team. At that point, they'll be asked to fill out a housing questionnaire and to provide contact information, what they've experienced, and who they are filing the complaint against. We do need that preliminary information. We need a complainant and a potential respondent. The intake team then will assess their information to see if this is a situation where the PHRC can investigate under state law. There are certain guidelines we must go by and certain jurisdictional elements that have to be considered. If the complaint is jurisdictional and it's timely, the intake team will help finalize their complaint. Then the person who the complaint was filed against will be notified. At that point, we would have an investigation. So they would be asked to provide information to a neutral investigator who is responsible for investigating if there was a violation of the Pennsylvania Human Relations Act. This investigator may ask for documents, what we call discovery documents, interview witnesses. They'll hold a fact-finding hearing possibly, or seek other ways of obtaining the types of evidence that we require for an investigation. Mediation services may be an option, depending on the case and if both parties agree to mediation. And the investigator will also explore if it's possible to settle the case before a finding. I want to mention here too that we've expanded in recent years our mediation department here at Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, and if that's an option for the parties, that is something that also can take place here at the PHRC. So once the investigation is underway, it can go a couple of ways. If the case proceeds to a finding, there are 2 possible outcomes: probable cause and no probable cause. If probable cause is found, the case may be conciliated. It can advance to a public hearing or be filed in court. At this point, the goal is to seek a remedy for the discrimination that did occur per the finding of the PHRC. The amount of time it takes to investigate a case varies. And it can vary a good bit based on the evidence, the speediness of the responses, and other factors. So there's not one time frame that we can offer at the beginning of an investigation, as every case is unique. So what do remedies look like in housing under PHRC? So potential case remedies, say it's a case for reasonable accommodation, which is a lot of what we see. So the reasonable accommodation or the modification is made to the unit or to the situation. Changes to lease and or other policies can be made. A posting of fair housing notices could be a remedy. training for respondents is something we do rather frequently, making sure that we are making everybody out that it pertains to aware of the responsibilities and to help them do better moving forward. Reimbursement of fees and out-of-pocket expenses. Money for humiliation and embarrassment. The Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, you may be aware, and you can access it on our website, has recently released guidance for emotional distress damages in housing, and that may be very interesting to our group here today, and that was released in August. So we can provide that information here, and it's available on our website, how we calculate damages for emotional distress in housing. And also civil penalties can be levied for remedy in housing cases. Some of our recent housing awards, 1.5 million. Housing provider failed to provide accessible units and ignored requests for reasonable accommodations for tenants with disabilities. And one of the most important things a housing provider can do is to engage in the interactive process. It's not, as you can see, it's not beneficial to ignore requests. I would mention that at this point. So that's a very good example of for a case of what could happen when requests are ignored for a reasonable accommodation, and of course the provision of those accessible units. $100,000 was another Fair Housing Award for maintenance workers sexually harassing a female tenant. $90,000, housing provider revoked lease and failed to address neighbor harassment based on race. $77,000, housing provider made discriminatory statements and refused to rent to a household based on familial status. So that's some really good examples of recent findings, of recent awards. So other information, Pennsylvania Human Relations Act, Human Relations Committee. We offer fair housing resources in many forms. So if you take a look at a slide, we have our Pennsylvania Fair Housing line, phone numbers right there, custom fair housing training consultations. Remember that our trainings are always free. You can have them in person or virtually, and we provide training for as few as 1 or 2 people up to as many in any kind of forum, as many as we can manage or virtually. So manage in a space and definitely have great partnerships, and we are happy to, again, come out and do that and customize this training to what the requester needs. Monthly trainings, we have our Fair Housing and Power Hour webinars that you're on now, and our new season is coming up, and you can check that out on our social media, what topics we'll be providing during this time frame, last Wednesday of every month. We have a link to our brochures and fact sheets that you might find interesting, and our 6th season of Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission, PHRC Speaks, is available on PCN. Fair Housing in the 21st Century will be kicking off our new season December 1st, and I'm excited to announce that Brittany Mellinger, my colleague, who is graciously taken over the slides and is a frequent presenter on this in this forum right here, will be our host and OC. Kira Bowman will be stepping into the producer role. So it's our 6th season, but it will be a fresh venue and fresh format for that presentation, and that's every other Sunday for the season from December, I believe, till May. So be on the lookout for that as well. So on this slide, we see more information on how to contact us. I'm Caroline Eister, Director of Fair Housing, Commercial Property. My contact information is there. There's a QR code to scan, which you can do at any time, but in the while we're doing question and answer or sharing information here. And I also would ask Brittany to drop into the chat. Had some attended Rural Housing Summit recently and had some great resources there, and I'll share that with everyone. Brittany has also dropped the feedback survey link into the chat if that's more convenient for people to use. We'd love to hear from you. So at this time, I would encourage anyone who has any questions or would like to point out any discussion points. We have a few minutes for question and answers or discussion. Oh, thank you for providing that link for the Housing Alliance Summit. That was the second summit for those of you who may be interested moving forward. It was their second summit and it had doubled in size. Really exciting to see partners from all over the state represented, and that will be definitely, they have announced that there will be a third. So that's something I would recommend to everyone in this group. Another resource while we're talking would be our beloved community tour. Our executive director is traveling through all 67 counties on a listening tour. And the locations are available on our websites and social media platforms, and you can take a look to see when he will be coming to your community. And what that is a fantastic opportunity for us to hear what is the concerns in housing and in education, public accommodation, employment, as we refer to it here as compliance. What are the community's concerns in those areas, and also as far as racial tensions or any kind of civil rights concerns and what you see happening in your community. They're generally in the evening after work hours and during the week, but not always. So you can take a look at that. Brittany has graciously put that, is that what you put in the chat? Thank you, Brittany, for that. So really, we're getting great responses, and it really is a nice way for us to come together and for communities to be heard throughout the Commonwealth. I believe that this week's events are in the western part of the state. So if that's convenient, but I think they're circling back. I think Allentown is coming up next week, but I will have to familiarize myself with the locations, as we have several. So there's no shortage of opportunities to come out and be heard, and for us and our executive director to become familiar with the diverse communities around the Commonwealth. So if there's no questions, I would like to thank everyone for attending, and I am happy to take any questions, and here or after, you have my contact information. Also feel free to reach out to OC Mellinger or myself for any kind of training and resources you would like. At this time, I'd like to thank Max and Deb, Hetty, and OC Mellinger for all the support for today's presentation. Thank you all.